Good morning. I'm Angela Comstock, the innkeeper here at the Grafton Inn. We are very excited to bring to you a series of stories that'll cover vast timeline about the history of the inn, the town, and the Wyndham Foundation's role here in Grafton. We are proud of celebrating 220 years of continued service here at the Grafton Inn. As many of you know, the inn is one of the oldest operating inns in the United States. Having first opened its doors in 1801, the inn was renovated by the Wyndham Foundation in 1965, restoring it as a gracious country inn and ensuring that this important piece of the Grafton economy would survive many years into the future, attracting tourists to the area, creating jobs, and generally supporting the area through the inn's economic activity. I would like to introduce to you Bill Toomey, our local historian and our former assistant innkeeper here at the inn for 30 years. I'd like to turn this over to Bill, and he'll be speaking on various subjects in this series of about 30-minute video segments for you all to enjoy. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Angela. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. I feel so honored and so joyful at participating in the 220th birthday anniversary of this inn. I spent 30 years working here as the assistant innkeeper, and I can tell you that every one of those years is a treasured memory for me. I could never have imagined enjoying adult employment as much as I did down the time I spent here, both because of the wonderful staff I got to work with and the extraordinary guests that frequented this inn. I would like to say before I begin that I am not, strictly speaking, a historian. I'm more of a storyteller, but I shall do my best to present things as factually as possible to you today regarding the history of the inn. As Angela mentioned, you can't really talk about the inn without discussing, to a certain extent, the town, because the inn is an organic outgrowth of the town itself. And it remains to this day the heart of the village, 220 years after its founding. To think that it is still functioning in its original site over that period of time, in its original building, which is what makes it unique, because there are many inns in the country still functioning on an original site where there was an inn, but the original inn burned down long ago. And it's really something of a miracle that this inn didn't burn, along with many others, when you hear how I will describe the heating system in the inn back in the old days. But to begin at the beginning, Grafton, which of course wasn't known as Grafton in the early days, was opened for settlement in 1763. At least that's when the first settlers came here and successfully began a village. It would be good to keep in mind, given the rapidity with which things happened after the village started, it's a good thing to keep in mind the extraordinary degree of difficulty that was involved in starting a village here, because this was virgin territory, it was virgin forest. There were no roadways leading into this area. And people that came here had answered an offer from the British Crown to settle here. It was a land grant that was administered by the governor of New Hampshire, Benning Wentworth by name. And they had first issued the land grant about 3 years before 1763, around 1760, 1759. No one took up the offer. I assume that was because of the degree of difficulty. Finally, some brave souls made the leap. And keep in mind that in coming here, not having any roadways leading in, men had to clear the forest here by hand, using simple hand tools, saws and axes. You can't bring animals such as oxen and horses into a forest because there's no grass that grows there. There would be nothing to feed them. Their primary task in coming here was to clear the forest as fast as possible so they could get things to grow. I don't know if any of you have ever done any work in forest management or even in gathering firewood, but any of you that might have tried to like chop down a tree a foot in diameter with an axe will sympathize with the problem they faced. A tree of that size would have been a sapling here in what was virgin land. The trees grew to be very large and of great diameter. Clearing them was an enormous task. And the original settlement was not down here in the center of the village, which is sort of in a little valley. They chose to begin a settlement on the hill above Grafton, called Middletown Hill now. And the reason they chose that site was the hilltop probably got several hours of sunlight more per day than the valley did. And that sunlight was critical to the growth of food. How they managed that first year, I can't imagine. To have come in, cleared enough land, they had to build shelters for themselves to get through one of the harsh winters in Vermont, which back then were really cold. This morning it was down to 3 degrees in Grafton, and that would be a mild day compared to what would have happened back in 1763. Nothing to have temperatures go down to 25 below zero in the winter. And so at any rate, they had to clear that hilltop, and much of the help they had was that wasn't hand labor, was fire. Burning as much of the forest as they could to get rid of it was a common technique, and gave rise ultimately to the first cash industry in Grafton, which was the production of potash, where the residue from the burning was taken and refined, and then barreled up and shipped off back to England or down to the southern colonies, where there were large woolen mills. And potash for many, many years was used as a refining product in the cleansing of raw wool. And it became the first cash industry in what was to become the town of Grafton. But the people, once they got the village settled up there, they decided to call the town, for want of a better name, Tomlinson. Tomlinson was the name of the man that had set up the land grant in England that parceled out the land on which these people settled. And so they named the town after him. That was obviously later to change, and I'll tell you when that happened. But once the little settlement got fixed up there and people kind of got their act together on top of the hill, bit by bit, movement did start down the hill. And the reason for that was the irresistible draw of the stream power down here, water power. And there were 2 streams in Grafton that flow through the center of the village, uniting just south of the village to form much of what becomes the Saxton's River. Well, the minute they could construct dams along those streams and create holding pools, then they had something that would really advance the progress of settlement, because the water power itself, the water being released from the dams, powered water wheels that of course powered the machinery to power grist mills, sawmills, fulling mills, shingle mills. I mean, there were probably a dozen mills ultimately set up between the town of Grafton and what's now the town of Bellows Falls that borders on the Connecticut River. But at any rate, over the next 20 years or so, movement began down the hill into the valley here. And bit by bit, settlement, homes began being constructed here. I would mention, just to keep an awareness of where we are time-wise, that during this 20-year period, the American Revolution took place. And there were certainly some men from Tomlinson that participated in the revolutionary forces. And doubtless, too, there were those people in the village that remained faithful to the crown. There was a real divide in the United States at that time. Not everybody agreed with the revolutionary principles. just as we don't agree about many things politically today. But at any rate, certainly there were a certain number of men. It did not drain the resources of the village, but someone like Captain John Barrett, who was a hero in the Revolutionary War, and who ultimately became a leading figure in the town of Grafton, was a member. So if we look forward to what I would call the initial seed of what is to be the inn, the Grafton Inn, the first store licensed in Grafton was a 2-room log cabin down here on what would be Main Street in Grafton now, owned by a man named Henry Bond. And in 1787, he was granted a license to open a store. And in his store, he sold one product only, and that was rum. It was very popular. Legend has it that they brought that rum, presumably in winter, in fact, had to be in winter, since there were no good roadways into Grafton, brought it into town with ox-drawn sledge following the course of the Saxton's River all the way up into Grafton, and stocked Henry's store with rum, and he was in business. Well, as with any business that's a success, entrepreneurs look at that and see ways to improve it. And sure enough, the following year in 1788, basically in the very room in which I am presently sitting, but in a different structure, a tavern was opened by a man named Samuel Spring. And being a tavern, he advanced upon the idea of Henry Bond. He sold rum as well, but in this case, people could come in and enjoy some food and some drink and some companionship. It wasn't a takeout situation as Henry Bond's store was. So that was really the first seed that began the whole process of the creation of an inn. And Henry Bond, it was hard to say how long Samuel Spring maintained his business here, but by 1801, not all that many years later, the home that Samuel Spring had opened his tavern in had been destroyed, had been taken down. And I assume that it was done, I'm just guessing in this case, that was done by Enos Lovell, the man that first opened what was to become the Grafton Inn. Now, he didn't open his doors until 1801. And he was granted a license to open a hotel where he could take in lodgers as well as providing food and drink for his guests. Samuel Spring's house had been taken down, and in its place was erected a 2-story brick building. And that building exists today. I am sitting right now in part of that very brick building. Just opposite me here are 2 windows, beside that a front door, and on the other side of that front door, another 2 windows. That was the extent of the building when Enos Lovell opened it. And it exists today. Here it is. At any rate, it was a whole new chapter opening in the town of Grafton. Advancing that business was the fact that the first bridge ever constructed across the Connecticut River had been built in Walpole, New Hampshire, crossing into Bellows Falls. There is a bridge there now that is no longer functional, and it was just south of that, right at the base of the village of Bellows Falls, that this bridge was constructed crossing the river. A very important fact in the development of Grafton, because it then became part of the main stage route that would come up and cross right through the village itself. And that bridge is something, I mean, people scoffed at the idea that anyone could build a bridge over that river. And when it was completed by a New Hampshire man who lived up in Rindge, New Hampshire, it was considered one of the architectural wonders of the 18th century, 19th century. At any rate, it spoke to the fact that ever greater amounts of traffic were coming to Grafton. Just the fact that Enos Lovell opened a hotel here meant that there was a possibility of lodging people, which meant that there were travelers coming through the village, because you don't open a hotel in order to lodge people of your own village. It has to be people coming through who are visiting, either on business or here for pleasure. In those early days, I assumed that most of it was for business. Salesmen coming here, leather goods salesmen, perhaps entertainers, traveling musicians. Such things had been true since the Middle Ages. And people selling dry goods, people selling cloth and fabric for making clothing. All those sorts of things were happening, and Enos Lovell was there to catch that business. Not a lot of history is known about those early years in the inn. But by the time another 20 years had passed after 1801, the inn was doing a vigorous business. And we know that because it, at that point, doubled in size, somewhere around 1820, 1825, somewhere between those years. And what happened was a duplicate building was constructed to what was already here. So again, a 2-story brick structure. Again, a front door, 2 sets of windows on either side of the front door. So when you're standing in front of the inn, you can see distinctly the 2 front doors and the sets of windows. I actually have with me a picture, which I hope you can see, of that early inn. Now, here would be, in this end of the building, right inside that window is where I'm sitting right now. This is further up the street towards the White Church. And this is the earliest known photograph of the inn. It was probably taken right about the time, just before the Civil War, I would say. The exact date isn't known. But at any rate, what you can see also in this picture, if you can see that closely, is you can see a dividing line right down the center of the building where the 2 sides were joined. And you notice that the windows on one end are higher than the windows on the other. And that is so, but guests who come to the inn know this in many different ways. When you walk from the lobby area of the main inn into the dining room, you take a step up to go into the dining room. When you're in the garden room, there is a rampway that leads down that accounts for that elevation. On the front porch, there's a rampway that accounts for that elevation. And I have read in one historic account that the architect that supervised the construction of the addition had made a mistake in his calculations. And I can assure you that that isn't so. It was not a mistake. People were superbly skilled in building back then. That is why so many of the structures they built then we are still using today. And I spent many years during my career here at the inn in the cellar of this building, solving different problems that arose. We won't talk about those to any extent, but I can assure you that when you get to where the addition was put on, you run into bedrock. And if they had wanted to extend a full cellar up through the addition, they would have had to blast, and that would have surely destroyed the structure that was here. And so they simply elevated the sills, continued on, and made these slight elevations accessible through rampways and steps. So 1820, 1825 accounts for doubling the size of the inn. How long Enos Lovell managed the inn and ran it successfully is unknown. But there were then a succession of innkeepers that followed him. And clearly the development within the town continued apace. Someone like Captain John Barrett, whom I mentioned before, had previously opened a store up on the top of Middletown Hill. He could see that this center of the town down here now was going to become what was critical to the establishment of the community. And he urged his partner in the store up there to move the store with him down to the center of the village. That gentleman refused and stayed up on top of the hill. Captain John allowed himself to be bought out. He moved down here and he constructed a building almost across the street from the inn right now, which now houses the post office and town offices. And that was the Barrett store. And he became a very wealthy man operating that store. It was a large store. It provided all sorts of product for people here. And he also wound up building the Barrett House, which I am looking at right out the side window of the inn here. It's a beautiful big colonial house. And it is a house that is now managed by the inn and accommodates our guests. It's also one of the houses that I personally find most attractive because it has preserved most of its historic character inside, while at the same time having central heating, hot running water, those kinds of nice things that guests expect. That element of historic character is valued greatly by certain guests that come here. I remember in particular, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward spent many vacations here in that house during the Christmas season, following Christmas until New Year's. They were very fond of the place, in particular because of that unique character that it has. So back historically into the 19th century, it was in, I should have mentioned that it was in 1791 that Vermont joined the Union, becoming the 13th state. It was also in that same year that Grafton changed its name from Tomlinson to Grafton. It did it by way of auction. They auctioned off the privilege of renaming the town. And a fellow named Joseph Axtell won the privilege with a high bid of $5 and a jug of rum. Now there's a certain irony in his renaming the town, because people felt, what was the point of naming a town after Tomlinson when he was a man that never set foot on this side of the Atlantic? Well, Joseph Axtell renamed the town Grafton after the town he had come here from in Grafton, Massachusetts. And I have been given to understand that Grafton, Massachusetts was named after the Duke of Grafton, who also never set foot in the United States or in America or in the colonies. He was an English aristocrat. So certain irony there, but at any rate. Okay, we've reached the point where the inn it's now an extended two-story structure, as you saw in the photograph I showed you. Now we advance the story to the time that would probably be described as the golden age of the inn, the first golden age of the inn. When the inn was purchased just after the Civil War, around the year 1885, around the year 1865, was purchased by Harlan and Francis Phelps. Brothers, Francis, often known as Pa Phelps, was an affectionate name. And right after purchasing the inn, Pa Phelps stayed on to manage the business. Harlan went west to see if he could come up with some capital for improving the facility. He went to California and prospected for gold. He was an ingenious man, a very intelligent fellow, and also a lucky man. And he returned to Grafton only a couple of years after going to California. And he returned with about $4,000 in gold money. And with that money, they took the roof off the inn, built the third floor, and built the wraparound porches on the inn. And since that time, the inn has not really changed at all in its external appearance. It may have been painted different colors down the years, but the structure itself looks very much the same. I would suggest that it was also perhaps during the time of Enos Lovell, but certainly by the time of the Phelps brothers, the early days of the Phelps brothers must have seen the barn, which many guests that come here are very familiar with, that is attached to the inn by a breezeway. That picture doesn't reveal anything regarding it, but I have seen pictures from the early days of the Phelps brothers in which you can see the breezeway that connects to the barn. And there would have to be some sort of way of sheltering the carriages and wagons that brought people to the inn, as well as their horses, sheltering and feeding them. And the barn itself was an excellent structure that stayed there for most of the life of the inn, right up until 20th century. It was ultimately, when the inn was restored, and we'll talk about that later, the barn itself had suffered some deterioration, and it could not be reconstructed safely as it was, just simply reinforced and made habitable. So it was measured and photographed and taken down. As much of the original material was used as could be. And the barn that stands there now is of the exact dimensions of the historic barn, but now suitable for multi-use in our modern day and age. But certainly the barn was there. Traffic was heavy. Business was great in Grafton in those days. I will mention two of the foremost industries in the town. First and foremost was wool. It was during the late 18th century that a diplomat, a man who had been a diplomat in the early years to Spain, was able to bring out of Spain the treasure of a few merino sheep and brought them back to this area. And you'd have to call those sheep fast breeders. By the time of 1850, there were as many as 10,000 merino sheep roaming the hills of Grafton. Now that tells you a couple of other things. First of all, most of the hills of Grafton, around Grafton, had been cleared of their timber because there was pasture land then for these numerous sheep to graze. There were, as I mentioned, fulling mills set up in Grafton. There was a fulling mill over on the Houghtonville branch of the Saxtons River, right? I can, basically looking through this window, I can see where that fulling mill would have been. And it was owned by two men that set up what was called the Grafton Manufacturing Company. It's just down the street from the inn here, basically a stone's throw. You could hit a golf ball there with no problem. But that little fulling mill, before the Civil War, was producing 70,000 yards of woolen cloth a year. And of course, that woolen cloth, a lot of it went into making blankets and uniforms for the Union soldiers during the Civil War. It was after that point that the woolen business in Grafton, after the Civil War, bit by bit, over the next 15 years, the woolen business began to decline. At that time also, the same time wool was so strong in Grafton at the time of the Civil War, the Grafton soapstone quarries had opened up. And so there was a lot of traffic in Grafton for those two businesses alone. There was also in town a big chair and sleigh factory. Ultimately, there was a cooperative creamery, and there were a lot of there were a lot of cottage industry. There was a lot of cottage industry that took place here. People, for example, making fly rods, doing specialized needlework. It was a very industrious town and very prosperous, numbering probably between 12 and 1,400 people at the peak of its development, roughly double what it is today.